Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, Solving for Offtake, Insights from the Green Fuels Accelerator. I'm Georgie York, the National Policy Officer for Bioenergy Australia. Bioenergy Australia is the national industry association committed to accelerating Australia's bioeconomy. Through our work, we're committed to advocating for supportive policy and market mechanisms to drive the development of Australia's low-carbon liquid fuels and renewable natural gas sectors. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, the traditional custodians on the land on which I'm speaking from today, and acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which our attendees are connecting from, and pay my respects to elders past and present and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Please feel free to introduce yourself and where you're watching from in the chat box below. And if you have any questions for our speakers, please use the separate Q&A box, which is also located at the bottom. Today's session is being recorded and will be shared with all registered attendees and onto our YouTube page. So today's webinar looks at one of the biggest challenges in developing a low-carbon liquid fuels project, offtake. Project developers, lenders, and investors consistently identify weak demand and unresolved offtake risks as a key reason for why projects with strong fundamentals do not reach final investment decision. In today's session, research will be shared from Cyan Ventures' Green Fuel Accelerator on best practices for tackling the offtake challenges, and you'll also hear directly from offtakers and experts. Throughout today's sessions, we have a few live polls that will pop up on your screens. When you see a poll appear, if you could please take a few seconds to click and enter your response. This will be able to help us get a sense of the room, as well as shape the conversation as we go. We'd really appreciate your participation with this. Today's webinar will also conclude with an audience Q&A with our speakers, so please do take the time to ask any questions in the Q&A box throughout the session, as we would love for attendees to help drive the conversation. I would now like to welcome Dr. Fraser Thompson, who is the co-founder and managing partner of Cyan Ventures, as well as the domestic chair for Bioenergy Australia's Low Carbon Fuels Alliance of Australia and New Zealand. Fraser leads the Green Fuels Accelerator program, which supports the advancement of commercial-scale low-carbon liquid fuels production. And today, Fraser will be leading us through our jam-packed webinar agenda. So over to you, Fraser, and thank you so much.
Terrific. Thank you, Georgie, and thank you to the Bioenergy Australia team for hosting this session today. And thanks to everyone for joining, including our list of great speakers that we have. The reason that we're doing this session is that, from our work in the low carbon fuel space, not only in Australia, but internationally, the common issue that comes up most across projects, across investors, across government officials is always, how do we solve for offtake? And this is not unique to low carbon fuels. It's common to any kind of first of a kind sector where we're introducing a new product, which is often at a significant green premium, and we have markets that are at best nascent, and we're trying to navigate. And so what we felt was useful was to share some of the insights from the work that we're doing for the Green Fuels Accelerator, where we've talked to a range of different off-takers of different types of green fuels and tried to understand, how do we navigate this challenge? What are the approaches? What are the barriers? And how do we overcome that? And we'll be sharing the full report later at the end of our Green Fuels Accelerator program. But this webinar was to give a bit of a taster of some of those insights. So it's not just us you'll be hearing from today. As you can see here, we're really honoured to have such a great list of speakers joining us. I'll introduce in a second, but we're going to kick off with an update on the low carbon fuel demand mechanism consultation. So this came out earlier this week. And has been a much anticipated announcement. So we're very excited. From May, it was announced that there would be a plan for a low carbon fuel demand mechanism in Australia. And now the consultation has come out. So we're going to hear more about that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Green Fuels Accelerator and some of the support that we're giving. My colleague Deirdre is then going to be joining us. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the insights from solving for offtake that we've found in our research today. And then we'll go to hand over to Natalie Lonergan, who's a partner at Mills Oakley and has done a ton of really great work looking through the legal traps that often derail some of the project discussions, and talk us through that. And then we're going to have a panel discussion where we're also going to be joined by Matthew Connolly, who's the head of Sustainable Aviation Fuel Strategy at Air New Zealand. And we'll probe a little bit deeper into some of the challenges and hear your questions. And then we'll have a quick wrap up and we'll get everyone out before 11:30. So it's quite an action-packed agenda. So to kick it off, let me introduce Tavalia Nylon, who's the acting branch head of the Fuel Security Task Force at the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. And Tavalia has had a terrific career in government. She's been working at various positions from not only at DQ, but the Department of Industry, Department of Energy and Environment, Clean Energy Regulator, and the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. And has obviously been extremely busy of late, given everything going on the fuel security lens, and also releasing this consultation. So we're very, very pleased that Tavalia could share the time with us and give us a little bit more detail about the consultation. So Tavalia, over to you.
Thanks, Fraser, and thank you, Bioenergy Australia, for the opportunity today to provide a brief update on the Australian Government's consultation on the potential low-carbon liquid fuel demand mechanism. I'd also like to really thank many stakeholders in today's webinar for their engagement with government on the LCLF policy world over the number of years that we've been working in the space. This consultation paper, as Fraser mentioned earlier, released earlier this week, builds on extensive government engagement through the Aviation White Paper and the Jet Zero Council, Net Zero Plan, including the Electricity and Energy Sector Plan and the Transport Sector Plan, Future Made in Australia consultations, fuel security work, and development of the National Bioenergy Feedstock Strategy. And across the years, we've had targeted engagement with the fuel supply chain and with international entities as well. So many people on today's webinar have contributed to these processes, and the feedback has directly informed this consultation paper. I'd also like to acknowledge our colleagues in the Department of Infrastructure and Transport who have been working very closely with on the demand policy to date. So this consultation forms part of the broader work that the government is doing to support industry establishment and help enable greater feedstock and LCLF supply into the Australian market. So why are we consulting now? Stakeholders have consistently told us that while supply side support is important, stronger demand signals are really needed to help unlock investment in our domestic LCLF production and support building our supply chains. And while we're delivering the 1.1 billion Cleaner Fuels program, that's now with ARENA to deliver, that is to boost the production of LCLF in Australia. Earlier this year, the government did announce that it is working with industry on a market measure to drive demand for these fuels and to reduce our reliance on imported fuels as well. The consultation paper is the next step for this conversation, and it seeks feedback on a potential demand mechanism that really can help support investments while also contributing to fuel security, economic opportunity, and emissions reduction outcomes. But I really want to stress, no decisions have been made on the final design of the mechanism, and that's why we really want to consult with a range of stakeholders on the conceptual framework, as well as key design elements, covering targets, fuel coverage, compliance arrangements, crediting arrangements, and including certification approaches. And that's all detailed in the paper. We're also seeking information and evidence to help us better understand practical implications of different policy settings. For many of you here today, that includes information relating to project pipelines and timing, expected fuel availability, production costs, supply chain constraints, market opportunities, investment considerations, and potential impacts on fuel users and industry participants. And this information is incredibly valuable to the policy development teams because it really helps us better understand what is practical, achievable, and investable in Australia, in the Australian context. So in the near term, timing for us is really important. And I know it's important to our stakeholders. The information and evidence that we receive through this consultation will help inform our impact analysis and advice that could be provided to government later this year. So while formal submissions close on the 15th of September, stakeholders don't need to wait until that deadline if information becomes available to them sooner. If you have information on projects, fuel supply, cost, market intelligence, and other insights that can really help us inform analysis, we'll be very happy to receive that information as early as possible. That can really help us refine our analysis, test assumptions along the way, and strengthen the evidence base. But we also recognise that formal submissions may still be provided up to the closing date of the 15th of September. We're also looking to finalise an online survey, which will be available very shortly, and that will really help us gather some quantitative information from stakeholders across the supply chain, and that will, of course, help us strengthen the policy development work. In terms of what's next, we're really keen to hear from a range of stakeholders, as I mentioned, from producers of low carbon liquid fuel suppliers, feedstock, investors, research groups, community groups, governments, right across the supply chain. It's really important that we consider the broader impacts, but also how we can design a policy that optimizes it for a range of stakeholders to make sure we have a sustainable low carbon liquid fuel industry into the longer term. So while the consultation focuses on the key design elements, there's the overall architecture and core policy settings that we really want to focus on. There are some details that we are looking to continue to engage with people along the way. So this is not the end of consultation. There's a real focus on the overarching policy design, but as we go through the design process, we will continue to reach out to industry. The key message I want to leave with you today is we are testing a conceptual framework. It is very open to input from stakeholders, and we really want to make it practical, achievable, and absolutely useful to a range of entities that are wanting to establish in Australia. And if you have information that you are able to share with us early, we very much welcome that. And you can send that to our team at LCLF engagements@deq.gov.au. The stronger the evidence base, the better we are able to provide robust advice to government later this year. Thank you, and I hope everyone takes a lot out of today's webinar. Back to you, Fraser.
Great, thanks Tavalia for that, and we really do appreciate you joining us. We know you're sort of jumping between meetings this morning too, so this is great. You can give us a bit of an overview, and what we'll do is we'll put the links for both the demand fuel mechanism and the fuel security mechanism in the chat, and really do urge everyone to take a close look at that. Both really well written, well researched documents that lay out some pretty clear sort of viewpoints and initial work that's been done to date. So we're not starting from scratch here, which is important, and also some really clear areas where input needed. But as Tavalia said, like it's a rapid consultation where we need to get responses back by mid-September. So urge everyone to take a look at that and engage. So with that, let me then move and talk a little bit about both the Green Fuels Accelerator and we'll probe a little bit deeper into some of this demand mechanism as well, because there's some really interesting points here. The starting context of this is important, and some of this will be well known, but just to sort of reflect on where we are. If you look at low carbon liquid fuels, it is a huge opportunity for us. If you look globally, just sustainable aviation fuel is estimated over a US $544 billion market by 2050, and with Asia at the center of this. If you look in Australia, research by CFC has shown that our domestic market alone could be worth around $36 billion by 2050. So we're not talking about a small opportunity here, really large commercial opportunity. And Australia has all the ingredients, as we know, to lead. We've got the land, we've got the fuel security needs, we've got proximity to Asian markets, and we've got a really strong FDI environment. What's more is that we've got a really strong pipeline of promising projects. So together with Mission Possible Partnership, we track all the green industry projects across different sectors. And if you look at low carbon fuels, there's 12 well-advanced projects, which have associated construction capex of over $19 billion. And if all of those were turned into fuels and, say, configured to SAF, for example, that would be close to 1,700 megalitres of production, which is about 17% of our current aviation fuel demand. So we have a really exciting pipeline of projects and many at earlier stage, but yet we have none that have reached financial close. And from our surveys with projects, with investors, the thing that keeps coming back time and time again is demand and offtake. So that's where this session comes in. But it's not just the policy settings. At first of a kind sectors, what we know is that it is really hard, even for the best founder teams, to navigate the full set of challenges that they're likely to face. When you've got not only the offtake contracts, which don't have a precedent, you've got financial structures that are not fit for purpose, you've got supply chain gaps, and you have regulatory frameworks which are really difficult to navigate. And so there needs to be support to these founder teams to help address some of these multitude of challenges. And that's where the Green Fuels Accelerator comes in. We are really thankful to ARENA for their support for this, as well as our various commercial partners from Boeing to Qantas to Mission Possible Partnership to Climate Tech Partners and various others for joining us in this. And this is an 8-month pilot where we're taking 7 promising low-carbon liquid fuel projects in Australia and doing some detailed due diligence on them to understand exactly where are the strengths, where are the potential gaps in really granular detail, and then providing some targeted support on some of those gaps from everything from financing to offtake to regulatory support, strategy assistance, etc. And it's not just us at Cyan Ventures. We have a range of experts that we can bring in depending on where those gaps are. So we have terrific experts from finance in the areas of offtake, in technical areas, in certification areas, in engineering, etc. So it's trying to provide, if you like, the kind of Swiss Army knife of kind of different support that a project needs to help them accelerate. And then at the end of this 8-month pilot, we'll reflect and see what worked and what didn't, and how do we scale this up as a permanent institution. The next slide shows that we've got 7 projects that we're part of this, and 7 really exciting projects, and many of them well known, from Lycella in Queensland and their HTL technology, Renergy in WA with the grind and pyrolysis technology, RDA in Queensland with the integrated ethanol to jet facility, Wagner also in Queensland with the SAF blending terminal and their converting waste feedstocks, Mercurius biorefining in Queensland doing this conversion technology of lignocellulosic biomass, Wildfire that just closed a capital round recently in Queensland with their own gasification technology, and Offtake in New South Wales, which has got some exciting cellulosic ethanol technology. These were 7 projects were chosen based on a mix of different stages of development and also different technologies. So for a Green Fuels Accelerator, seeing how we can add value and support these kind of exciting projects depending on very different contexts. I know many projects have reached out to us and said, look, can we be part of this? And I wish we could expand this to the multitude of other projects that are out there, all of whom look very exciting. Unfortunately, at this stage, this pilot is limited to 7, but we will plans to open up for a post-pilot to look for a further round where we'll open it up to projects, and we'll share that broadly. But in the meantime, we're using these webinars and various handbooks that we'll develop as a way of sharing the knowledge more broadly with the community of projects. So hopefully you get some of that benefit. So that's a little bit about the Green Fuels Accelerator. We now just want to switch and talk about demand, because that's what we're here for. And I thought, just to build on Tavelia's discussion of the low carbon fuel mechanism, it was worth sort of spending a little bit about just reviewing what some of the papers, some of the key elements of that, because there's some really rich content in all of them, but they're also quite long. There's like 85 pages in one and quite a lot in the others. So appreciate that not everyone may have had a chance to go through them. The first thing is that you look at the dates, and the dates are important. So not only we heard that the September 15 is responses needed by, but there's also a viewpoint of actually getting the first compliance period out by 2029. And that's really important from a project standpoint. Right? So when you're thinking about a demand signal into the market and matching that to operational dates, I think that's terrific that we're having that ambition to get something out by that date and get a mechanism in place, and then review periods in 2032. If we look at the next slide, there's actually this proposal of this kind of two phases. So 2029 to 2035 is this phase one that's been proposed, where it's basically a volumetric approach. And in the consultation paper, they've given a range of 750 to 1,900 megalitres in 2030, rising to anywhere between 3,450 to 8,900 megalitres by 2035. And it's in the consultation paper makes very clear that those fixed volumes are for sending a very clear demand signal, particularly for projects to reach FID. If you remember earlier, I said we've got roughly, if we maximised all the projects that are advanced in Australia today, about 1,800 megalitres. So that sits very much in that range in 2030. So it's all about, seems that phase one is setting a very clear demand signal to get this industry going. And interestingly, there's also carbon intensity thresholds that come with that. And then phase two, as the market matures, is envisaged from 2035, where it's shifting to carbon intensity benchmarks. So, shifting from just thinking about the volume to actually thinking about the carbon reductions, because as we know, a whole lot of low carbon liquid fuels have very different life cycle emissions, and the market will obviously evolve to reflect that. And there's a number of specific items there, including the trading initiatives that would come with that kind of scheme. So that's kind of the starting point, if you like, for the consultation, and gives a good basis for engagement. The next slide, on the design elements, I just thought I'd note a few that I thought were interesting. We talked about the ambitions and targets. The questions are in the consultation around, is the range achievable, the annual path, what the decline rate and carbon intensity should look like. On the obligated fuels, talking about diesel, jet fuel, and whether, questions whether petrol should be included, when to add other types of fuels, including maritime fuels. Obligated entities, it's proposed as various suppliers into the market. The compliance pathways, how we think about sort of surrender credits, buyout prices. And for those of you familiar internationally, that becomes a really big issue in places like the EU, for example, and a discussion about that. Looking at the carbon intensity, so that there's this threshold from 40 to 70%, which kind of is smack bang in sort of where we see the international range. And also think about how we think about things like land use impacts, and then questions of support for local production. So the purpose of this is not to seek feedback now around that mechanism. I just wanted to share a little bit about some of the content that's in that, but that's just a very high level summary. And I'd urge all of you to take a really close look at it, because there's some really good detail to us. And we've been, as an industry, have been calling this for a long time. So now it's out here. It's really on all of us, different stakeholders, to engage in this proactively. And there'll be a number of sessions for that engagement. I know also with Bioenergy Australia to get that feedback. So, and then the other thing is fuel security. The other paper of this also has some important impacts. So, a $3.2 billion strategic reserve of 1 billion litres of diesel jet fuel, higher minimum stock holding obligations, adding an extra 10 days for diesel, petrol, and jet fuel. And then looking through sort of incentive frameworks to keep the refining capacity in Australia. That is, hopefully gives you a bit of a flavour of that. I wanted to, now we're going to switch talking a little bit about, what are some of the insights that we're learning from Offtake at the moment. And I'm joined here by my colleague, Deirdre. Deirdre is an associate at Cyan Ventures and formerly consultant at McKinsey & Company in Europe, and she is part of the Green Fuels Accelerator team that's helping support these 7 projects. And offtake really is kind of the binding constraint. It's this demand. It's actually not, often it's not technology, but it's the demand that stops projects. And this has came out as the #1 issue in the surveys we've done with investors and with projects. And there's various shapes of that. Too few customers willing to pay the green premium, challenges with suitable certification, weak carbon pricing, counterparty credit risk, and tenor mismatch. So, off-takers may only want to buy for every year or 2 years, but we need 15 years plus for projects to be set up. And then we've got this challenge which people tend to be reinventing the wheel. So we often see term sheets negotiated from scratch, and the same issues that keep coming back, or lenders that tell us they keep having the same questions, the same points that they're making to projects over and over again, and no standard sort of templates and other aspects that go with that. So that's part of the reason that we want to address this. And if you look at some of the survey evidence, this was a workshop that we did looking at low carbon liquid fuels and some other green industry projects in Australia. And we asked what were the biggest barriers to financing. And we had here not only projects, but investors and what we call enablers, so other sort of supply chain actors. And you see here that the biggest one that came through was the policy uncertainty and risk of reversal. So hopefully with a demand side mechanism that will help address there. But we also heard issues around counterparty risk and the short offtake tenure, as well as things like certification and offtake attribute certainty. So there's a number of risks where the main message that offtake is at the heart of a lot of key concerns of both projects and investors in this space. We now want to sort of make this interactive as this discussion. So we are going to have some polling. And I thought the start to get us going is understanding who exactly we have in the room. You've got your options there, and we'll have to Georgie to put the poll up. So tick one box. Are you a project developer, a feedstock provider, an offtake supply chain player, an investor, an other expert? And I know we have lots of various people from government, from advisors, etc. Or if you've just wandered into the wrong Zoom call. I'll just give you a quick moment to flash to answer there, and then Georgie will flash up the responses. Okay, so we've got a mix of issues. So we've got about 30% project developers, a few feedstock providers, a few investors, and some who think that they could have been in multiple categories. And I'm glad to see that no one's wandered into the wrong call. So terrific, and it's great that we have that multitude of different stakeholders, because I think that does illustrate sort of how do we navigate and think about offtake challenges. Second question we want to talk about is what's the areas you want to learn more about. So is it understanding what off-takers on their mind? How do they think about their purchasing considerations? Is it around pricing structures? So we've heard someone's, should I be looking at cost plus one? Should I be looking at some benchmark, some cap and floor? Is it around contract structures? Your tenure, your penalty clauses, etc. Is it about managing counterparty risk, or is it about actually how do you do the off-take engagement process? So what does that look like going from initial engagement to an LOI to a short form to a long form contract? And I again appreciate that many of you will want to pick all of them, but we've just got the single choice in this one. So I'll give you a moment again to respond there. Great. So a bit of a mix. So pricing structures on people's minds, off-taker purchasing considerations, and how to think about the process. So very good. So those are topics that all these are things that we cover in the Offtake handbook. And Deirdre, I'll hand over to you, who'll talk us through, I guess a bit of a taster of some of the things that were found in the handbook. Deirdre.
Yeah, thank you, Fraser. So as Fraser already mentioned, we see offtake as one of the key barriers when it comes to low carbon liquid fuels projects reaching FID. And we've been going pretty deep on this. We've been speaking to experts both on the lender side as well as on the offtaker side. We've been working with projects, and what we've landed on is basically these 6 insights which we think all developers should know of. And we'll use that as a bit of a structure to guide you through our findings up to this point, but I'll briefly touch on them already so you already get an idea of what we'll be talking about. So first of all, wanted to flag that bankability really is a two-sided problem. And what we mean by that is, of course, on the one hand, you have the offtaker, who is after flexibility, market index pricing, etc. On the other hand, we have the lender who wants to see an offtaker of a good credit rating, long tenors, basically anything that gives them the certainty that the debt repayments will be made. And so what we see is that offtake, or bankable offtake, I should say, is really about finding the middle ground between these two positions. And we'll go into that a little bit later. And then secondly, on the product slate, and this is of course tied to the technology you choose. And what we want developers to understand is that your product slate really determines what you're going to have to do in terms of developing offtake contracts. And then thirdly, what we've seen in one of the workshops we ran last year with Mission Possible Partnership is that many people, many parties see tenor as the biggest issue when it comes to negotiating contracts. And that's because, like I already mentioned, off-takers typically are not that willing to commit for long tenors, whereas the lenders obviously want to see off-take contracts that at least match their amortization period. And then fourth one is on pricing. We've been looking into that. We've seen that there's many different pricing structures appearing in the market, both when it comes to separating the physical fuel from the environmental attributes, but also when it comes to how these prices are determined. And what we see there is basically that prices are very rarely fixed. And that's because there's just a lot of uncertainty in the input costs. Then fifth insight, and this is an interesting one, and that's on environmental attributes pricing. What we're seeing there, what we're expecting to there is that prices will be increasingly dependent on the actual low carbon value of the attributes. So currently the question is really, are you eligible? Is your fuel eligible for a certain certification? Answer is yes or no. And what we think it's moving towards is how valuable actually is it? And we think that that is going to impact the prices of that. And then finally, this is also a very important one when it comes to your bankable offtake, and that is that letters of intent are not a substitute for binding offtakes. Lenders are quite specific in what we see when it comes to bankable offtake. And what we see sometimes is that developers assume that a letter of intent might be sufficient when really it's not. So let's start with the offtake bankability. And what's important to understand for developers is what investors or debt lenders are testing on. Because if you know what they're testing on, you can design your offtake process accordingly. And when we speak to lenders, different parties on that side, we found out that basically they're all testing the same 5 things. And they might word it differently, but it comes down to these 5 gates, essentially. And so the first question they ask is basically, what's the counterparty like? What is the credit quality of the buyer? And is that sufficient? Is that acceptable to us? And if not, is there something in place to mitigate the risk that we might see associated with that? So that's the first one. And then the tenor is the second one. And I already touched on that briefly. And there the question is basically, is the offtake of a tenor that gives us the certainty that we will be repaid, that our debt will be repaid? Then the third one is volume certainty. So basically that comes down to revenue certainty. That's kind of tied into tenor as well. But what investors or lenders are looking for there is basically clauses in the contracts. Is there, for example, a capacity charge? Is there a minimum offtake? Anything that gives them the certainty that revenue will keep flowing in. Then on pricing, and we'll touch on that later in more detail as well, but what's important here to lenders is especially the price floor, because that is what's going to determine their downside case. And based on the downside case, that is what they are going to make their decision on. And then finally, what they're also looking at is termination. So what are the exit rights, what are step-in rights, etc. So the point we want to make here is essentially, instead of first designing your offtake and then go looking for financing, it might be better to start backwards and figure out what the investors might be looking for, and then design your offtake accordingly to make sure that it will be a bankable one. So before we continue, we have another polling question for you. So the poll will pop up again soon. And we're very keen to hear from the audience what you think is the biggest obstacle to bankability today. So we have sufficient green premium, off-taker creditworthiness, getting sufficient tenor, like I already mentioned twice, price and revenue predictability, buyer walkaway rights, and then the last one is basically all. So curious to hear what the audience sees as the biggest barrier, and then hopefully that will be in line with what we plan to discuss today. I think the answers must be flowing in soon. Right, okay, so quite a mix. Green premium, 18%, revenue predictability is quite a big one. And then there's also a large group of people that sees them as equally hard. So let's see if your answer changes after what we discussed today. So second of our 6 learnings was on the product slate. And what's key to understand here is that, of course, your product slate depends on the technology you choose. And it's important that you choose your technology and your product slate inherently with offtake in the back of your mind, because each of the technologies, we're all aware of them, they are listed here at the left. They all have their own product slate, so they each produce a set of products. And we've categorized them here in red, orange, and green. The red products being the core ones, the primary ones, so the big volume ones, the ones the financial case depends on, essentially. And those are products where investors are going to want to see a bankable offtake agreement, because that is what the revenue depends on. Then there's a second category, which is the orange one, which is significant byproducts, still relevant to revenues, but it's most often not necessarily something investors want to see a bankable offtake agreement for. Usually a term sheet is already sufficient, a well-defined term sheet, but a bankable offtake is not always required. And then we have the third category, the green, where typically these can be internal streams. So a sound plan for internal use, for example, for process heat is quite often sufficient. And so when we look at HEFA, for example, that's the top row, we see that both SAF and renewable diesel are core products. And what that means in terms of your bankability is that for both of these products, the investors are going to want to see a bankable offtake agreement. And so when designing your offtake and when thinking about investors, it's important to start these processes, both of these processes, just to make sure that you don't end up with one of your products turning into almost a merchant risk instead of a potential revenue stream. So that's important to keep in mind. So when we know what we're selling, then of course the next question is who is going to be buying it. And so each of these products have a different buyer pool, each with a different demand focus and different trading conventions. The buyer pools look quite different. So for example, SAF, as we know, is quite a nascent market, not very liquid, little market indexed pricings. Whereas, for example, renewable diesel is a bit more developed. That's been consumed, for example, by Rio Tinto last year quite a bit. The BHPs of the world are getting into it. So that's quite a different market. And what that means in terms of your bankability is that lenders are going to expect different terms in contracts based on the market context and based on your buyer pool. So, for example, if you are selling into a liquid market versus, for example, SAF, which is currently not as liquid yet, lenders might be willing to be more accepting of, for example, slightly shorter tenor, simply because they have the comfort, given its liquid market, that even if a deal falls over, there will be there can be replacing demand. And so again, your buyer pool, your product slate, your technology should really go hand in hand with what your investor wants to see. So it's good to keep that in the back of your mind when choosing your technology. Next insight, and we've covered this a few times already, but is tenor mismatch. And we see that there's a lot of push and pull around this topic in offtake. This is a chart from a workshop we did with Mission Possible Partnership last year, with about 50 attendees from both investors, project developers, and government organizations. And tenor mismatch was really flagged as a key issue here. And the reason for that, and I already touched on it briefly, is that lenders typically want to see offtake contracts with at least the tenor of the period that will be repaid, so the amortization period, and ideally with a bit of a tail as well for potential refinancing. On the other hand, we have the offtaker, which is a buyer in quite a new market, quite some uncertainty, and they are less willing to commit to these longer tenors. So you could easily end up with a tenor gap of about 10 years if you assume an investor wants to see a contract of 15 years and a lender wants to commit for about 5. And so it's crucial to bridge this gap in order to get to a bankable contract. And this doesn't necessarily have to be a negotiation until you get the buyer to sign for 15 years. There's multiple structures emerging and ideas popping up that could solve this issue. Then on pricing, we've described some of the structures we've seen today on this page. I won't go into all of them, but what I did want to touch on is, like I said in the beginning, pricing is rarely fully fixed. And that's because many of the inputs for low carbon liquid fuels are quite uncertain when it comes to price. So, for example, many require hydrogen, heat, energy, other feedstocks, and those are, of course, highly over time. And so fixed price, unless these costs are hedged, would mean that all of these price risks would end up with the developer, which is less attractive, of course, from the developer's perspective. What we also see is contract for differences. So, for example, a structure that is similar to that is what we see emerging in the UK right now with the revenue certainty mechanism. This is a mechanism where a government body acts as an intermediary, compensating for the difference between a predefined strike price and a reference price. And we've been doing some work on that as well. And we think, especially in combination with the mandate, this could be a very useful structure. And then lastly, we have the indexed price with a collar. And what's interesting about that one, I think that is what we want you to take away from this page as well, is that in any of these structures, what investors and lenders are interested in is the price floor, because that is going to determine if your downside case is still acceptable to them. So that is worth spending some negotiating and some thinking on. Then, and this is an interesting one, we have the environmental attribute pricing. And when selling low carbon liquid fuels, you're of course actually selling two products. So you're selling the physical fuel, but you're also selling an environmental attribute. And currently the question on that is, is your feedstock eligible based on the life cycle emissions reduction potential, as well as on the land use change? Question is binary at this point. What we see happening is that buyers are increasingly differentiating these environmental attributes based on the actual carbon value. So currently, say for example, the threshold for qualifying for an environmental attribute is 40% to 70%. Two parties could be on both ends of the spectrum and they both qualify. And what we expect is that increasingly prices of environmental attributes will be more and more linked to the actual carbon impact, as well as on the land use change impact. So before we go on, I'm keen to hear from the audience your thoughts on that. So keen to put a number to what we just discussed. So how big of a price differentiator do you think carbon emissions reduction and land use impacts will be? This can be a very rough estimate, but we really appreciate your input here. We have heard some numbers around, so curious to hear if that's in line with what the audience thinks. I think the results should be popping up soon. Right, okay, that's quite the spread. Well, that is in line with some of the numbers we've heard. They are in one of these categories, so that's good. Next on our list is the actual offtake agreement, because we've now discussed what investors are looking for, what your product state looks like, what pricing structures look like, and how all of that ties into your bankability. What we see when it comes to striving for a bankable offtake is that it's really a ladder, starting with a letter of intent, which essentially doesn't commit anyone to anything, but it's really the first step in the process. And then all the way at the end of the letter, we have a bankable offtake. And what's key to understand here is that that doesn't have to be one contract with the perfect tenor and the perfect pricing structure and everything the lender wants to see. It can essentially be a combination of any of the agreement types in between, depending on your context. So, for example, if a tenor gap is an issue, striving for an offtake contract with a tenor of 15 years might not be as achievable as, for example, a series of laddered offtake contracts. So a series of shorter term contracts laddered together to still ensure proper tenor. So that's just something to think about. It doesn't have to be one perfect offtake agreement. And Natalie will cover this in more detail in a bit. But before we hand over to Natalie, let's tie this all together in what we think is best practice when it comes to working towards your bankability. Because we've seen how your offtake relates to your bankability and how all of the different elements fit together. And we've tied that together in a 6-step process, which is here on the screen. And before we hand over to Natalie, just wanted to make finally the point again that your offtake should really be an integrated part of your bankability. So instead of first arranging your offtake and then go looking for financing, look at what your investors or lenders are looking for, and what that means in terms of what you should be doing when it comes to your offtake. Then we have a final question before we hand over to Natalie, and we're keen to hear from the audience what developments the audience think will unlock the most FIDs in this sector. So we have a demand mandate or standard, mechanisms to encourage longer tenor offtake, price floors and support mechanisms, deeper environmental attribute markets, more capital essentially, and clear certification. So very keen to hear from you where your head's at. Right. Okay. Lots of hope and trust for the mandate, as can be expected. So that's we agree. Back to you, Fraser.
Terrific. Thanks. Thanks, Deirdre, and thanks everyone for filling those polls. Interesting to see some of the responses. I guess I just want to give my reflections on some of those things that Deirdre presented. Just 3 big things that we often find with projects and where can sometimes go wrong is one, on their product slate. As Deirdre said, like the product slate is chosen by the technology without enough understanding of the offtake markets. And often you get these kind of orphaned products, which are actually still a considerable share of the end revenue of the project that haven't actually got a clear pathway to market. And so I would urge you, as all projects, as you think about that, one, think about that technology selection. What are those end markets that you're trying to reach? But also, beyond your core product, that secondary product, which may still be a 10% share of revenue or in that range, how are you thinking about that? The second one is on those different pricing regimes that, really important. And I think everyone's trying to feel their way here. Some of the mistakes we see is that the sort of rush to get to a fixed price, and it looks great, but the fixed prices come in too early, and then the costs evolve quite considerably, and then reopening that up again becomes a really painful process on both sides. And then the final one is, and I think sort of Deirdre spoke to that last slide, is that it is a process. It takes time. But just making sure in your projects that you're dedicating that time to actually that commercial focus as well. Often we see that project progress is somewhat influenced by the founder background. So if it's a very technology focused person, it tends to be the technology is really escalated and progressing well, but the offtake is kind of lagging that. So just making sure that offtake progress is keeping pace as much as possible with the other elements of your project become really, really important. So enough from us, though. We wanted to also get a perspective from what we think about from a legal perspective of like negotiating these contracts. Now, some of you may still be earlier stage, but a lot of you will be starting to enter this area. And it's really important, we felt, to have that knowledge of what are some of the challenges that you can face, and how do you think about that ahead of time. So we're really pleased to have Natalie Lonergan, who's presenting today, but is also one of our experts in the Green Fuels Accelerator. Natalie is a partner at Mills Oakley Law Firm, and she specialised in energy and infrastructure and has got more than 30 years experience. advising on projects across Australia and internationally. Interestingly, Natalie is also the regional director of the Asia Pacific Association of International Energy Negotiators, and she's also the co-chair of their Renewable Fuels Committee. And why that is important is that organisation is doing some really great work around understanding some of the legal templates and approaches that can be used to get these projects off the ground. So we're really pleased to have Natalie presenting today and not only giving an Australian perspective, but also her view of how she's seen some of these issues play out in markets such as the US, which are a bit further advanced in these areas. So with that, over to you, Natalie.
Thank you, Fraser. Sorry, coming off mute always takes forever for me. So to start, when we talk about an offtake agreement being bankable, realistically, the real question is whether the contract allocates risk in a way that the producer, the buyer, and ultimately the financiers can live with over the life of the project. And that does not simply mean pushing as much risk as possible to the other side. The objective is to allocate each risk to the party best able to control it, mitigate it, or price it. That becomes particularly important for first-of-a-kind and low-carbon liquid fuel projects because the offtake agreement sits alongside feedstock contracts, technology arrangements, EPC contracts, logistic contracts, certification regimes, and financing arrangements. And all of these pieces need to work together to actually ultimately have a bankable offtake. The first point is that most of the commercial problems we've just heard about ultimately have to be managed in the offtake contract. Counterparty credit, it's the previous one. Counterparty credit is an obvious example. A 10-year offtake from an entity that cannot support the payment obligation may not actually give lenders 10 years of bankable revenue. So we need to consider including parent company guarantees, letters of credit, and other securities. Tenor is another major issue. Buyers understandably want flexibility, whereas lenders want visibility of cash flow for the period over which the debt is being amortised. That mismatch may not be solved by one clause in a contract. It's likely to require a portfolio of contracts, potentially an intermediary, some government support, attribute sales, or some other structure. The same applies to pricing. In many of these markets, there is not yet a mature liquid benchmark for the green component of a product. The pricing formula, therefore, has to deal with both commodity exposure and environmental value. Volume and delivery. Volume's not just about the headline take or pay percentage. The operational mechanics matter as well, such as the annual contract quantity, the nominations, tolerances, delivery windows, make-up rights, storage constraints, and allocation of shortfall. A contract can look bankable on paper, but still be commercially unworkable if these mechanics are badly designed. For first-of-a-kind projects, commissioning and ramp-up also deserve very special treatment. Mechanical completion does not necessarily mean that the plant immediately produces nameplate volumes at a consistent quality. The offtake should distinguish between commissioning, ramp-up, and normal operations with appropriate tolerances and staged remedies, rather than imposing the full steady-state regime right from the get-go. Product quality is another major issue. The contract should say what happens if the fuel's off spec. For instance, can the buyer actually reject it, accept it at a discount, require a cure or blending process, or require a replacement supply? It also needs to specify when repeated off-spec supply becomes serious enough to justify termination of the offtake contract, and which will then have ramifications for the other documents, the other agreements in the suite. But one point that we particularly need to make here is that the offtake cannot be negotiated in isolation. If the seller has a firm obligation to deliver fuel, but the feedstock contract is interruptible, And the EPC contractor is a broader force majeure regime and protection under the EPC contract. Or, for instance, the logistics arrangements do not provide corresponding remedies, then the seller may be carrying risk it simply cannot manage. So from a legal perspective, bankability is often about ensuring the various contracts are aligned across the entire project, ensuring that the risk allocation is aligned across the feedstock, plant performance, certification, logistics, delivery, and offtake throughout that suite. Now we'll move to the provisions that can actually make or break the financeability. The first of these 10 provisions is the conditions precedent, commencement, and ramp-up regime. For a developing project, you need absolute clarity around when the seller becomes obliged to supply. Has the plant achieved completion? Has it passed the performance testing? Is the feedstock supply secured? Are all necessary regulatory and certification requirements satisfied? Has financial close actually occurred? The contract needs a realistic long stop date, but it also needs a sensible mechanism for dealing with delay. You do not want a buyer having an easy walkaway simply because a complex project is late by a relatively short period. And after the commencement, there should usually be a clear transition from commissioning into ramp up and then into steady state supply. That helps avoid imposing full operational consequences before a first of a kind facility has demonstrated stable performance. Force majeure is also much more nuanced than it sometimes appears. The producer needs protection for events genuinely outside its control. But from a financing perspective, you do not want a force majeure definition so wide that the buyer can simply stop taking product because market conditions have become unattractive. So the definition, exclusions, mitigation obligations, and prolonged force majeure termination regime all matter. The regime should also be checked against the corresponding rights that the producer actually has under its feedstock, EPC contract, and logistics arrangements. Change in law and certification is particularly important in this sector. The risk is not simply that a law changes. It may be that the product remains physically saleable, but loses some element of the regulatory or environmental value that justified the premium. That may arise because the certification methodology changes, an incentive disappears, a mandate changes, a particular feedstock is treated differently, or buyer reporting requirements evolve. The harder drafting question is how the contract adapts without giving either party an open-ended right to renegotiate the economics. That may require objective adjustment mechanisms, replacement benchmarks, fallback standards, expert determination, or even a tightly constrained price reopening process. Termination rights are also a major lender focus. If the buyer can terminate for convenience or broadly define breaches, the project may lose the very revenue stream against which the debt was advanced. That is why cure periods, objective triggers, and lender step-in rights are so relevant. Moving on to credit support. Credit support needs to manage, which is the next slide, the actual exposure. A parent guarantee may be appropriate in one transaction. A letter of credit, bond, escrow, or another form of support may work better in another. Environmental attributes are becoming an increasingly important part of value. The contract needs to be very clear about who owns them, when they transfer, what registry applies, and how double counting is prevented. There is also a related issue that is particularly important in low carbon fuels: measurement, verification, data, and audit rights. For instance, if the premium depends on life cycle emissions, feedstock provenance, or sustainability characteristics, the parties need to know who calculates the carbon intensity, which methodology applies, and who verifies it, what records must be retained, Who can audit them, and what happens if a later audit or methodology change alters the result? That can be just as important economically as the physical fuel specification itself. I would also avoid being overly formulaic about governing law in disputes. The appropriate law and forum will depend on the party's location and the financing, but there is often a useful distinction between contractual disputes, which may go to arbitration or the courts, and genuinely technical or measurement disputes, which are much better dealt with through expert determination. An apparently innocuous restriction on assignment can also become a financing issue if it prevents the producer granting security over the contract or giving information to the lenders, regulators, government funding agencies, or relevant certifying bodies. Those provisions need to be built with financing in mind from the outset, rather than being fixed prior to financial close. The broader message is that there is no single clause that makes an offtake bankable. Bankability comes from the architecture of the agreement package as a whole and from allocating each risk to the party best able to control, mitigate, or price it. The earlier those issues are worked through, ideally at term sheet stage, the less likely they are to re-emerge as expensive problems throughout long-form negotiation or lender due diligence. And that's the legal aspects covered.
Thanks, thanks Natalie for that, and it's really useful, and it's a reminder that some of these legal issues become, they become the basically the binding constraints to actually getting these projects to close. And the reason we really want to get Natalie involved in this was that not only for the projects that are well advanced, that are right in the thick of these things at the moment, but also for those of you who are a bit earlier on. What are the things to have in the back of your mind? And I appreciate maybe it's like drinking from a fire hydrant there with all the different issues, but we hope at least with the handbook we can share some of those sort of process details to help you guide that. So you've heard a lot from us sharing different thoughts on offtake. We thought, why don't we get an offtaker in the virtual room to actually talk through some of these issues? So we are very pleased to have Matt Connolly with us today. And Matt is the head of Sustainable Aviation Fuel Strategy at Air New Zealand. And he's formerly had positions at Air New Zealand as like their energy transition lead and climate disclosures. And before Air New Zealand, Matt worked as an advisor to a range of corporates across Australia, New Zealand, and East Asia. So really well versed to help us understand some of these issues. Matt, maybe just to start off, would love to just get your perspective, like from an Air New Zealand standpoint, can you give us just a bit of colour around how you're thinking about sustainable aviation fuel?
Thanks, Fraser, and the introduction, and thanks to Cyan Ventures and Bioenergy Oz for having me today. The obvious point is that we come from a part of the world where connection truly matters. Like obviously, aviation is kind of economically critical to countries like Australia and New Zealand, but we would say that it's kind of critical socially and culturally as well. And there are no good alternatives to travelling between our cities and our countries than air travel. So the kind of underlying reason we care about this is not just because we need them for business and trade, but to see our kind of family and friends as well. More specifically, though, kind of as a global energy transition continues, as geopolitics continues to evolve, as industrial policy kind of changes the shape of the economy, we believe that the pressure for sectors like aviation to kind of mitigate their impact and adapt their business models is going to continue increasing. And so it's kind of partly policy, it's partly customer, it's partly competition, but also because we have a choice about whether we're going to go through an orderly energy transition or a disorderly one over time. SAF's obviously the most important kind of energy transition lever for long-haul aviation, central to our transition plan. And we've got a bunch of sort of ambitions and commitments that we're out in the market with. We have a 10% SAF by 2030 ambition and a kind of 2050 net zero. And we're doing a bunch of stuff to contribute across the whole system. We're kind of buying a bit today. We're building supplier relationships. We're exploring kind of production in the region. We're developing our Scope 3 program to create customer demand. We're engaging in policy discussions where it's kind of appropriate, engaging in kind of supporting the common standards and the market development. But there's one thing I wanted to read you, actually, from a kind of ambition, a World Economic Forum ambition statement that we signed more than 5 years ago, that talks to probably where we're at on this offtake conversation at the moment, and the fact that you really do need to get all of the pieces of the puzzle across the supply chain right for them to work. And the line is something like this. Signatories to this kind of ambition are committed to working together to address the chicken and egg scenario, where producers and airlines are either unwilling or unable to carry the initial cost burden of investing in new technologies to reach a scale where they are competitive with existing fossil fuel-derived options. Because that's really the nub of the issue here. Like when I talk to my corporate finance teams, they say, what's the premium to jet fuel? And we can go round in circles about why that's maybe, there are more sophisticated ways to think about it than that. But that's the finance question we always get. And the reality is airlines alone can't kind of cover that margin. And so it's going to take each person in the value chain kind of coming together and collaborating and playing their part to get new facilities off the ground.
Great, thanks, Matt, for that intro. To delve a bit deeper into that, from an airline perspective, what are the challenges of thinking about meeting some of those SAF targets? I guess price is obviously one big aspect of that, but how are you sort of thinking about some of those challenges and how to navigate them?
I guess I'll say a little bit about the challenges, but maybe there's probably another important piece of context that I think is worth pointing out here, and that's that you would all know this, but there's no one SAF market. There's compliance markets and there's voluntary markets, and then there's different geographic markets, and sort of along the lines of some of the comments DJ and Natalie were making before, with the kind of segmentation based on the characteristics of environmental attributes, we see different markets based on the characteristics of different SAF. And so kind of along those lines, there's a couple of key challenges. Cost is obviously one big one. Line up the kind of offtake costs that we're talking about for your projects against airline EBITDA, and you'll kind of quickly see why. Another specific one in the context of offtakes is interesting, and that's airlines typically see these long-term offtakes as a new source of risk for airlines compared to the types of contracts that they're used to signing. And so often are expecting to get a price benefit or a cost kind of benefit from signing up to them, which can be tricky when some of the kind of pricing structures we see are things like benchmark SAF indices, or something that doesn't kind of bake in that strategic benefit that you're looking to get by signing a long-term offtake. Really complicated to do, but that's kind of one key consideration is, cost is tricky, but how do you turn the commitment to a long-term offtake into an advantage? Yeah.
Yep. And can you talk us through, Matt, I guess when you think about the, what airlines are looking for in terms of, if you're thinking about a SAF procurement, obviously, there's the price aspect, what goes without saying, but what are some of the other factors that, an airlines will look at when they're evaluating different potential projects of SAF projects?
Yeah, we have a framework, predictably, but I think each airline will have a different framework, and so that's probably a really interesting question for offtake for projects to have with the individual kind of airlines or other offtakers that they're talking to. Price is certainly one, but sort of as I was kind of alluding to, the kind of the value is another, and whether that's the kind of price advantage relative to other options, or indeed the kind of the kind of the scope 3 value associated with those. Like, a year ago, I use this analogy all the time, so apologies if you've heard it before, but a year ago, you would go to a SAF conference and you wouldn't hear the word customer, airline customer once. I was at a conference in Melbourne a few weeks ago, and there was a single panel on customers, and it was the last of the day, but at least there was one. And so I was kind of really encouraged to hear, or kind of Fraser in the science slides and Natalie in your comments, in kind of increasing recognition that actually it's our customers who are contributing to the cost of SAF and who will be contributing to the green premium. So I think that's one really, when we think about price, like that is the context in which we're thinking about. We think about the kind of portfolio risk, or the portfolio that we're building as well. How does this particular technology complement others? How does this particular feedstock complement others? How does the regions in which we can use this SAF and the purposes for which we can, does it meet compliance requirements in market X and market Y and market Z? The maturity of the project on the across its life cycle, and then all of the kind of normal delivery risk and some of the kind of co-product questions like you talked about. Those are the kind of commercial questions we ask. Kind of related to that, the way it hits our books matters as well. So the kind of, based on the structure of the agreement, the kind of financial treatment can be important. Be that whether there's kind of equity involvement or the kind of accounting treatment that matters, and affects the kind of the profitability that we report year on year. And then obviously we have a kind of long list of sustainability considerations as well. So that is things like feedstock type technology, land use shed, direct and indirect land use change, things like the certifications and the documentation and the registries and the carbon intensity, and the kind of social impacts as well, the kind of impacts on modern slavery and human rights and just transition. So it's commercial sustainability, and then there's obviously the kind of the strategic questions as well, like how does it position us, or kind of protect us around policy change and competition and our kind of 2030 ambition, or is this kind of a conversation about supply later on? But those are probably the three big buckets, at least that our framework kind of thinks about. It's kind of commercial and financial, sustainability and strategy.
Yeah, great. And just lastly, Matt, is like, if you think about any kind of advice for projects that are listening to this about, when they think about engaging with a customer like an airline, any thoughts on things you'd recommend, like what's the right time to engage, for example, and what's the kind of minimum bar of kind of information an airline would expect before they actually want to start that conversation?
Yeah, increasingly we're kind of sending that framework that I just articulated to you with a subset of questions out like pretty quickly. And so the ability to answer questions like the CI that you're kind of targeting, the kind of certification schemes, the kind of price structures that you'll entertain or you kind of won't entertain, all the kind of standard project development information as well is stuff that's pretty interesting to us from the start. But I think that we will have different requirements from the next offtaker, which is kind of painful, I acknowledge. So you probably we'll need to kind of talk to each potential offtaker about that. So I guess that's the first thing. The second thing is, I was talking to a project developer the other day, and they had this great line that I'm going to kind of shamelessly steal, and it was something like, the line was something like, we think of our investors as our customers and just call everyone else a partner. Because the idea was that, like you were kind of getting to before, you almost need to kind of start with the arithmetic that your debt and equity is looking for and then work back from there. And, in some ways that kind of makes your offtaker conversations much easier. Because it doesn't turn it to this conversation, it turns it into a kind of holding hands conversation, which I think is really nice. So I guess that's the second point is, you've been making it kind of through the call, but think of your investors as your customers, and because really we're all on the same side here. And then this isn't. There's probably another one that people have heard me mention before, but personally, I'm like extremely excited about how platforms and portfolios and partnerships are going to support the sector to scale. We've been trying bilateral airline project offtake agreements for years, and as you say, none of the kind of 12 projects in Australia have kind of reached FID. And I'm confident that many of them will, but increasingly the idea of platforms and portfolios and partnerships that can build more diversification and share risk even more is something that we're really kind of curious about. Yeah,
it's great. Thanks, Matt. We had a number of questions that come in the audience. Like unfortunately, we can't get to them all. There was one actually I thought particularly interesting that David sent through around. How do you manage the feedstock risk with the offtake risk? So if you can get an offtake contract for 10 to 15 years, can you get a back-to-back feedstock agreement for that? And often we've seen precedents where it's hard. Internationally, we have seen those long duration contracts, but it's a really important issue, and it's we've often seen farmers have been burnt before. So it's a number of instances in the US where the projects basically didn't have the offtake contract locked in, and so they go plant these crops, and then suddenly they're left high and dry when that company can't sell that product. So there is that kind of, I think, that fair degree of sort of justified skepticism, right? Which is sort of, I think, step one is that quality of that offtake contract. I think leads to the confidence in your feedstock providers. And without sort of taking us off piste, and there's probably a separate session on feedstock that we should do, but some of the traps we do see with feedstock is that often there's not enough scenario analysis around what happens, for example, in a drought year. Like effectively, your ag residues can double in price, and the economics gets knocked off its head, and there's not the kind of diversification, and you're stuck with, as Natalie alluded to, maybe really onerous take or pay penalties and other penalty clauses associated with that. So I won't try to delve into that but it's maybe we think about a separate sort of piece looking into that one, but it's a really important piece of this puzzle. Just before we close, Natalie, if I can come back to you on just one question. With the project developers, I guess what should project developers have worked through before they start engaging with off-takers from your perspective? Like, are there sort of like some must-haves that they've already nailed down before they even have that first conversation with off-takers?
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, the simple way of answering is they need to have a very clear view of exactly what they're offering. That should include, they need to be able to articulate what the product specification is, the expected volumes, the ramp-up profile, which is really important, particularly for first-of-a-kind projects, the target tenor, pricing structure, a certification pathway, and delivery arrangements. They also need to understand what level of counterparty credit they need and what the minimum bankability requirements are. They're probably the main things. The important point is to know what you must-haves before you start negotiating. Otherwise, you'll end up with something that potentially could look very commercially attractive, but later has to be renegotiated once you hit financial close.
Terrific. Look, thank you. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Matt, for taking the time to share your insights with us. We really do appreciate it. And with that, so we're at time, and I'd hand over to Georgie to close us out. Say from the Green Fuels Accelerator, we'll continue these sharing sessions. We want to try to get as much of that content and discussion going. And we also, of course, welcome your thoughts, and thank you for everyone the comments and questions that you put in the chat. Sorry we didn't get a chance to go through all of them, but we will do our best to incorporate them. But thank you to all our participants for taking the time to be with us today. Over to you, Georgie.
Thanks, Fraser, and thank you so much to all of our speakers. We really appreciate your time and your insights. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today and asking questions and really helping us drive the conversation. So that wraps up today's webinar, which is part 1 of this series. And next Thursday, we'll be holding part 2, which will be focused on solving for finance together with Cyan Ventures. So next week's webinar will be focused on the challenges of finding development and construction capital for low carbon liquid fuel projects. You can register for this webinar at the link that will be in the chat box. We will also send it across in a follow-up email to today's webinar. There'll also just be a short evaluation at the end of today's webinar. So if you could take a couple minutes just to provide some feedback, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you, and we will see you all next week.